Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 81 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks. They took on the Vancouver Canucks and lost by a score of 2-1 in overtime. The good news is that Game 81 of last year was a matchup against the Edmonton Oilers, who ended up scoring 9 goals against the Sharks in a San Jose 9-2 loss, while this time around, the Sharks have actually managed to keep it a lot closer, even get this game to overtime before losing it 2-1. The bad news, on the other hand, is while this does appear close on the scoreboard, it is a game in which the Sharks don't actually play all that well. Now, this is somewhat understandable. The Sharks roster that already isn't very good has also been dealt with a ton of injuries. In particular, just today, we learned of a bunch of new ones that required multiple emergency call-ups, but at the same time, their opponent here tonight wasn't really all that great either. The Canucks are in a very similar situation to the Sharks in the sense that they are also missing the playoffs and are also just looking forward into what will happen for themselves next season, and are even dealing with a couple of injuries of their own. No Elias Pettersson here tonight, at least the forward version of Elias Pettersson. Their starting goaltender Thatcher Demko is out, and the goalie who was starting this game for Vancouver is a rookie playing their first career game in the NHL, and the Sharks only managed to put on net about 16 shots through the full 65 minutes, or very close to 65 minutes of this game. It starts off in the first period, and San Jose is just not looking all that great. At least they're not giving up a ton of chances to Vancouver at 5-on-5, but the Canucks would end up getting a 5-on-4 power play for themselves for 4 minutes off of a Luca Cagnoni double minor for high sticking. That's where the Canucks would get a lot of their opportunities, a lot of their shots on goal, but in the end, it remains a 0-0 game after 20 minutes. In the second period, the Sharks would strike first with a goal from Macklin Celebrini, his 25th of the year, and this does come on a Sharks power play, which is something I do want to talk about a little bit here. The power play has been struggling as of late. It's not really been scoring much, and so this could be viewed as somewhat as of a positive. I'm not quite so sure. This is a situation in which Celebrini essentially has to take things into his own hand and just take a great shot here that does beat this Canucks goaltender clean in the top corner to make it 1-0 San Jose. But when it came to their actual power play performance here throughout this game consistently, it still wasn't very good. And it simply comes down at this point to just poor execution. This last power play that the Sharks had at the end of the second period was just so terrible to watch. And it's not just one player, it is pretty much every single player on the ice. Will Smith passing it to absolutely nobody and giving the puck away. Celebrini on the entry, losing it quite easily. Kovalenko entering the zone before everybody else does, and so now having to tag back up to get back on side and killing off multiple seconds. Just huge, very obvious and kind of just silly mistakes being made by Sharks players who we know are better than that, and it just right now they just don't seem to be in sync. They don't seem to be having that clean play, and perhaps it is just a case of the last couple of games of the season, you just kind of want to get it over with, and so you're just not at your sharpest, you're not at your best, and that is obviously hurting San Jose at this point. The power play also underwent multiple personnel changes. I know there was some drama yesterday with the Sharks or Warsofsky substituting Will Smith on the first power play unit with Lucas Carlson. This to me was just Warsofsky trying to have more of a net front presence on the top power play unit, and Wenberg is the best player for that. And so if they want him to do that, they need a new power play quarterback because he's usually that guy on the 5 forward unit, and then they put Lucas Carlson because they don't want Smith in that role. It kind of made some sense. Here tonight, they decide to maybe sort of spread the love a little bit between their 2 power play units. They have Kovalenko join the top unit. Cagnoni also takes his place as the quarterback, and then they're joined by Celebrini, Smith, and Toffoli, and Eklund and Wenberg both end up on the second power play unit. It's an interesting approach. Warsofsky is trying different things. I don't really think it really worked out at this point, and it seems as though we're just letting time run out on this season. Only 1 game left. And then when it comes to the third period, the Canucks would manage to tie this one up at 1. That's a goal from former San Jose Shark player, or at least draft pick, Linus Karlsson. He was actually involved, if you can recall this, the Jonathan Dahlen trade. He played a couple of years with the Sharks. Dahlen did. Karlsson never actually suited up for a game. He's doing some okay things here in Vancouver, and he gets the game-tying goal that makes it 1-1. Then we go into overtime. Here, I have mentioned already multiple times the last few games that the Sharks have gone into post-regulation play. They need just some new tactics. I mean, the one major possession they had here tonight with, I think it was Liljegren, Celebrini, and Smith on the ice, ended up just with a weak Liljegren shot from the point that ended up right back in the hands of Vancouver, and meanwhile, they pretty much kept possession the entire time. Yeah, they have Quinn Hughes, who's like the best defenseman in the league, and he obviously does help out, but still, the Sharks just really leave a lot to be desired here in this 3-on-3 play. They went with a few different units. Liljegren was the only defenseman to actually get time in the overtime, which was quite interesting. Otherwise, they went with some 3 forward setups. I was surprised to not see Cagnoni be given a chance here, but I digress. I guess it doesn't really end up mattering because, again, the strategies from the Sharks in the first place just don't really seem all that good. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line of Smith, Celebrini, and Kovalenko. I know that the previous first line that the Sharks had with Smith, Celebrini, and Toffoli, the nickname for that line was the sleepover line. Here, I'll call the Smith, Celebrini, Kovalenko line the centering pass line, because that is seemingly the one move that they constantly try. Perhaps that's a Kovalenko thing. Perhaps that's just what they're attempting to do. But there was one particular shift here tonight where they had this opportunity 3 or 4 times. And it's not as though that this is a bad play, but it can be a little bit predictable. And the Canucks read it every single time. It never really amounted to much of a great chance on net. And yet they were doing it over and over and over again. It's like, at a point you got to try something else. When it comes to the individual performances, Celebrini, I did not think he was very good yesterday against the Calgary Flames. Relatively invisible, at least by his standards. Though I do feel as though he stepped it up here tonight, was actually pretty good. Seemed a lot more involved. Manages to get this goal on a very, very nice shot. And generally was one of the Sharks' better forwards, even though that isn't saying much because this was a game in which the Sharks didn't actually play all that well. When it comes to his 2 line mates, however, next with Will Smith, again, I didn't think Smith had a great night here tonight. He kind of had an opposite of Celebrini, where Celebrini had a lot of good things, but then there was that mistake for sure on this Linus Karlsson tying goal in which he doesn't have a strong enough back check to get back and cover Karlsson, who ends up being the one who puts the puck in. Smith, on the other hand, it was a game in which I wouldn't say filled with mistakes. He just wasn't making much of an impact, but he did have a strong back check, which is where the opposite part comes in, on a opportunity shorthanded. I believe that the Canucks had. It was a 2-on-1 that he's able to equalize and make it into a 2-on-2, and that stops the play in his tracks. So it's nice to see that even in game 81, he is making that effort to get back in the play. That was great to see, but otherwise didn't really have much of an impact. And then when it comes to Kovalenko, I was unsure of whether or not we'd even see Kovalenko in this top line position. I didn't think he was great against Calgary, and I thought perhaps we might end up see Bordeleau getting this position, but of course Bordeleau is injured for the game here tonight, and so Kovalenko ends up being and giving another chance on this top line. There were some moments, obviously Kovalenko still manages to have a couple of plays where you are left rather impressed. This will sometimes be his ability to win battles, his ability to handle the puck, or even just some decent playmaking abilities. But the problem is that there's a certain level of unreliability here when it comes to Kovalenko. It's not fully in the same bucket as a Klim Kostin, who will just give pucks away completely very obvious situations. Kovalenko is smarter than that, but not by such a significant margin that Warsofsky can feel super confident with having Kovalenko on the ice, which is perhaps a reason that in the overtime period, we saw Smith, we saw Celebrini and Eklund and Wenberg and Toffoli. We specifically did not see Kovalenko get any ice time in that 3-on-3 play. Again, can go back to the unreliability there. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have, again, Eklund, Wenberg, and Toffoli. Despite all of the injuries that the Sharks were dealt here for this game, it did not affect the top 6 in any which way, which is a good thing as well. The Sharks already didn't play particularly well in this game, and imagine if their top 6 actually took a hit, it would be an even worse look. Well, when it comes to this second line, I did feel as though the standout player here was probably Eklund again, just as was the case yesterday. It's not as though it was a spectacular or very impressive game for William Eklund, but there were some smaller plays that just simple winning type of moves in which he's just batting pucks out of the air in good moments or setting his teammates up for solid passes, solid zone entries, where I thought Eklund had a positive effect on this game. Again, it's not anything amazing, and so you can kind of be left a little bit disappointed watching him, but I think it's important to mention that Eklund has not had the easiest of times this season. Obviously, the most notable thing is the Fabian Zetterlund trade from about a month ago at this point at the deadline that obviously blindsided Eklund and hit him pretty hard. But another important aspect to remember is Eklund is the only forward on this Sharks roster currently who played a considerable amount of games last season when the Sharks were again really, really bad. And so to have gone through that year that was extremely depressing where the Sharks lose over 60 games, and now to come into this season where it feels as though you've taken these steps forward, you've made the changes necessary to be better, and at the end of the day the results have remained much the same, and you have again lost over 60 games, it can be frustrating, it can be demotivating for a player like Eklund, and especially at the end of this season when you are once again just sort of hoping that the year can come to an end. Eklund still being able to put up okay performances, even if they're not spectacular, outstanding performances, I would say is at least a good thing, and I'm hopeful that if the Sharks can be even better next year and actually get out of the cellar for once, that will be an opportunity for Eklund to really start to pick up some consistency in his game and some sort of just general motivation level there as well. When it comes to his two other line mates, Tyler Toffoli had a very kind of normal Tyler Toffoli night in the sense that he was relatively invisible. He doesn't score a goal here. He doesn't get too many chances. And so if that's not happening, he's not really providing much to this team. His play as well in the overtime, I'm kind of not surprised to see him in this position, but it is kind of risky, especially against a somewhat speedy team, or at least that speedy Quinn Hughes, who was on the ice for pretty much the entirety of the 3-on-3 for Vancouver. To see Toffoli be given this role, because speedy is definitely not something you would use to describe Toffoli, and it doesn't end up working out very well for the Sharks, but I guess he is that type of leader player, and he can be a goal scorer if the Sharks would ever actually touch the puck in overtime. And when it comes to Wennberg, he's more of the middle ground, I would say, between Toffoli and Eklund. Not quite at the Eklund level, definitely not near the bottom there with Toffoli. I thought Wennberg was at least pretty decent. There was some solid defensive zone plays from him, I would say, not a huge liability or anything like that. There was a higher level for him to reach. It kind of reminded me of some of the Wennberg games from early this season where he's like not bad, but also not very good. That seemed to be the case tonight. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, this is where we start to have the substitutions. As I mentioned earlier on, there were a bunch of injuries that we learned about today. No Ostapchuk, no Jack Thompson. Both of those players left at the end of the Calgary game, so those didn't come out as that much of a surprise. And the replacement for actually not the replacement for Ostapchuk, because there was another injury, that being Thomas Bordeleau. He does not play here tonight. The replacement for him is Danil Gushchin coming into the lineup here. He gets the call-up opportunity. I was obviously happy to see that, even though there's just now 2 games left on the schedule. And to be fair to Bordeleau, he was in a bit of a difficult spot last game because going up against Calgary, a team that was really desperate and trying to maintain a spot in the playoff race, they'd obviously play harder and a quicker game. Here tonight against Vancouver, who know that they're out of the playoffs, it's not going to be as difficult. But Gushchin definitely does end up outperforming Bordeleau by a significant margin. And in very similar ice time, Gushchin gets about 12 and a half minutes, which is a couple minutes more than what Bordeleau got. But this is because he ended up getting caught out in the overtime on a very, very long shift, which is already a good thing in the sense that the fact that Warsawski was willing to give him a shift in the 3-on-3 overtime shows that there is a certain amount of confidence in this player. Like I mentioned earlier on, he did not have Kovalenko out in this spot, but he was willing to have Gushchin out in that type of position. When it came to his actual 5-on-5 ice time, on the other hand, he had less than 9 minutes here tonight. That is more so in line with what a fourth liner gets, even if on the stat sheet it says that he's on this third line. And yet, even in that limited viewing period, we actually saw a couple of pretty good chances from Gushchin. He came relatively close to actually scoring here tonight, and it was very much some of the similar things that I felt as though we were seeing back in the early parts of this this season when Gushyn was first up with the Sharks, those first 10 games that he had played at the beginning of the year. It was one in which Gushyn, I don't think, had a massive impact, as did pretty much nobody on this team, but he was definitely more of a positive than he was a negative. Defensively, I thought he was actually rather solid. His play in the overtime, despite being tired, despite being out against some really great Canucks players, was actually pretty decent for just a young player like that. So I was rather impressed with what Gushyn was able to do here. And I mentioned earlier on that Kovalenko could have potentially gotten substituted off of this first line if Bordeleau were healthy to play. Maybe that was a look that Warsofsky would go for. I actually wouldn't be that surprised if Gushyn ends up getting a spot on this top line. At least I would hope for it. Again, going back to the fact that he was given overtime ice time and Kovalenko was not, and I think Gushyn has more to give offensively. I think it would be really cool to see those three players together. Going into this offseason, Gushyn is a restricted free agent. Mike Grier will have the decision of whether or not he wants to bring him back. Gushyn will also have the opportunity, if he wants to head to the KHL, which we know is something he considered last offseason. I am hopeful that there could be some sort of deal reached here. I really don't want to lose Gushyn at Bordeleau. I don't think would necessarily be the end of the world to lose out on him, but I do think Gushyn has something to show here in the NHL, and I hope the Sharks are going to be willing to give him that chance, not just going into next game, potentially being on that first line, but also going into next year if he sticks around. When it comes to the two other players on this line, we next have Ty Dellandrea. He's kind of the fill-in as this third line center in favor of Ostapchuk. And obviously, I've been pretty hard on Dellandrea throughout much of this season for obvious reasons. He has one goal despite having played over 70 games this year. I will say, however, Dellandrea I actually thought played relatively well here throughout this game. He does take a delay of game penalty near the end of this third period, or actually the middle part-ish of the third period, and actually does not end up getting another shift past that point, which I guess shows some frustration from Warsofsky, as Dellandrea is a player who is known to be taking a ton of minor penalties for absolutely no reason. But prior to this being taken, I actually thought Dellandrea had a few good shifts. He used some of the skills that he does have as a player, which is basically his physicality and some decent speed to go in on the forecheck. He actually had also a very good setup for Danil Gushyn on one of his chances on net. And so I can't be too disappointed with what Dellandrea did. And then when it comes to Cam Lund, he does return to the lineup here tonight after being sick and did not play yesterday against Calgary. He showed some okay chemistry with Gushyn. I don't think he quite hit the same highs as Gushyn did, but it was certainly not a bad outing for Lund. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we have Goodrow, we have Grundstrom, we have Gregor, the GGG line here once again. I would say that it was not a terrible game for these three players. I actually thought they had some pretty effective shifts. Grundstrom, continues to be able to pot some just general shots on net. Goodrow I didn't think was too bad. Gregor have showcased some speed here tonight. All in all, I do think this was a pretty good game for a fourth line. I would just wish that Ryan Warsofsky approached this group of players more so as a fourth line. The fact that they were the three players on the ice for the final 45 seconds of this game, tied 1-1, is just not a good look, and it leads to a couple of chances for Vancouver where they very much almost took the lead in this game. And in the back of my mind, not quite literally, but in the back of my mind, I was sort of hoping that the Canucks would score just so I could simply talk about how silly of a decision it was. It did not end up happening, but something that Warsofsky does need to get through here is that this fourth line, despite him believing that they're actually very good defensively and are perfect players to shut down anybody in the NHL, that's not actually the case. When it comes to the Sharks defensively here tonight, sort of like the game against Edmonton, I will say that they tried their best and they did some okay things, starting off with this top pairing of Thrun and Liljegren. Thrun, I continue to go back and forth. It feels as though every single game we get a different situation. Against Edmonton, I was thinking, maybe this is an NHL defenseman. And then yesterday against Calgary, I thought, okay, he's not an NHL defenseman. He's not going to have a future here. But then here tonight again, I thought he was actually okay. Nothing amazing, nothing super impressive, but he made a couple of decent plays out of his own zone in terms of breaking out the puck and wasn't a huge liability on the ice. So it was an okay game for Thrun. With Liljegren, there continue to be those head-scratcher mistakes, like, as I mentioned earlier on, the weak shot that he took in overtime to just completely give up possession is not something that you want to be doing in that spot if you're Liljegren. Like, that needs to be cleaned up. And there are just moments defensively in which he takes a bad penalty in front of his own net, things like this, that is just not really going to showcase him as a reliable enough defenseman. But there are enough, I would say, positives throughout with Liljegren that, unlike Thrun, who I'm really not sure if he's got much of an NHL future here, I'm going back and forth. Liljegren, I do feel as though he can be an NHL defenseman for this team next season. Probably more in that bottom pairing, but I guess we'll see the moves that the Sharks end up making. When it comes to the second pairing now, we have Karlsson with the recently emergency called up Luca Cagnoni. There was no Thompson here tonight, as I mentioned earlier on. We knew that was going to be the case, but there was also another player who does not play in this game, that being Jan Ruda. And this one definitely came as more of a surprise. He had missed a lot of time with a long-term injury that kept him out a good couple of months. And then he came back, played 2 games, was actually pretty good, scored in the last one yesterday against Calgary, and now he's right back out on the sidelines. I'm not sure if he'll play on Wednesday against Edmonton or not, but Cagnoni gets the call up, and I wasn't hugely impressed with Cagnoni's first few games that he played in the NHL. He showed a few flashes, but nothing really that amazing that made me think, okay, this is a penciled-in player for next year for San Jose. I do think, however, that tonight was definitely one of his better games that he has had in the NHL. Offensively, there's still not a ton to really enjoy, though there were a couple of plays here, one of them in which he picks off a pass right at the offensive zone blue line to set up a Sharks player for a good opportunity. That was good to see, but it was really so defensively that I thought we started to see some things come together. His first period was a little rough. There were a couple of shifts where he does give the puck away, but as the game wore on, I think he settled in and actually ended up being pretty good. And so Cagnoni, relatively impressed with what he was able to do. When it comes to his defensive partner, Lucas Karlsson, not as much. I think Karlsson was a little bit below where Cagnoni was, which would normally be really good for Cagnoni, but the fact is that Karlsson is also an AHL defenseman, so not exactly the perfect player to compare yourself to. Karlsson, I don't think, had a great night. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we have Vlasic, and he is joined by Jimmy Schultz, who is also an emergency call-up here for this game. Schultz has generally been pretty good defensively throughout his call-ups with the Sharks. He's played now a few games with them this season, and I think that sort of continued here tonight. Offensively, I will say he doesn't really have many at all offensive instincts. There were a few times here where the puck is either coming towards him and he's just not in the correct spot, or he ends up just making a really bad pass, and he makes you think okay, if this guy's ever going to become anything, although he's 28, 29 years old at this point, he's going to be purely a defensive defenseman. So Schultz doesn't really leave you with any sort of offensive flair, but I thought defensively he didn't do the worst thing in the world here tonight. And then when it comes to Marc-Edouard Vlasic, he kind of was, again, a bit suspect here. He takes a bad penalty, generally had a couple of rough moments, and so not hugely impressed with Vlasic in either of these 2 back-to-back games. And then when it comes to the Sharks goaltender, we have Georgiev. Interestingly enough, the Sharks have played against the Vancouver Canucks 4 times this season, and in each game they've used a different goaltender: Blackwood, Vanacek, Askarov, and now tonight it is Georgiev, and he's coming off of an outing where he gave up 8 goals against the Minnesota Wild. Certainly not a pretty performance. Here tonight, however, he is significantly better. He lets in 2, and he does end up getting the loss, but he certainly did as much as possible to try and keep the Sharks in this game, to try and get them the win. He just didn't really have much offensive support in front of him, and so I wasn't entirely sure who would end up getting the final start of the season. I was leaning maybe a little bit more towards Romanov to play that final game against Edmonton on Wednesday. Now, however, after this solid outing for Georgiev, and considering he is that more veteran player, I imagine he will have the final game of the season. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action indeed on Wednesday against the Edmonton Oilers, a team that has beaten the Sharks already 3 times this season and is looking to sweep the season series. I'm honestly not entirely sure what to expect from that game. The Oilers have been dealing with a ton of injuries, and unlike with the Sharks, who past this next game on Wednesday, their season is done, the Oilers actually have playoffs to look forward to, and yet there's a whole handful of players who are very questionable. McDavid didn't play here tonight. Draisaitl is still on the sidelines. Nugent-Hopkins only just returned. Wallman is questionable. Ekholm is questionable. So I don't know if we're going to be facing against a really tough Oilers lineup, or if it's going to end up being a much easier style of game. game. But at the end of the day, the Sharks, there are no easy games on their schedule. They're the team that is last place. They're the team that will finish this season in last place. Hopefully, they can get at least one win to end this season, because right now they're on a 10-game losing streak, and it would be 11 to end off the year. Class dismissed.